Good good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development Crop Talk 2021 Winter Series. If you have any questions today during this presentations, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of each presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. I will be making a one-time registration for our next Crop Talk event, which will be held February 3rd. At that time, I will have other dates available. So it will be just a one-time registration for the next dates that Lionel sets up. So it'll be a little bit easier. So you'll all receive an invite to that for the February 3rd, and you can register for all the events after that. Anyway, with that, Lionel, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to our winter series of Crop Talk. I was talking with a few people, and we were wondering how we could get some more information out to producers and industry people regarding some of the issues that happen through the winter and some of the decisions we need to make before spring seeding, and we thought we could bring Crop Talk back for some winter meetings. With this one, we just by watching the markets lately, they've been kind of going crazy, and which is a good thing for a lot of producers that still have grain to sell, and starting to get lots of calls on just different crops and crops that producers are looking at growing, maybe not for the first time, but trying to do their best to get maximum yields. And so I thought we'd start with flax production. Been getting quite a few calls on that, and looking at maximizing yields. And I think Dane sent me an email that made a lot of sense. And sometimes it's not just maximizing yields, it's maximizing the agronomics and the economics as well. So I think he's going to be addressing a few of the things as he goes through his presentation today. I'd like to thank Dane for putting this together, and we'll start the first of our winter series on increasing our flax production. So Laurie, if you want to turn the screen over to Dane, we'll start with his presentation.
All right, thank you, Lionel. Kind introduction there. I know I pulled this information together the past few days and few weeks. However, with prices being the way they are, I've had to adjust the numbers a couple times in order for it to be as up to date as we could. But with that, I've got about 47 slides here to go through today, so it should take me just under an hour to discuss all the ins and outs. It could certainly take a lot longer, but I'll try and be brief. If there's any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box, folks, and then Laurie will pass those questions on to me as they're applicable throughout the conversation here today. All right, so starting off, we'll go through a couple things: fertility planning, disease control and rotation, variety selection and seeding, managing that crop for high potential success. So why flax? Well, that's why you're all here today. So first up, let's start with why many of you are listening. Flax pricing is at or near an all-time record high, as shown by the green line on the graph in front of you. And strong markets coupled with record average yields in Manitoba this past year have been drawing a lot of interest. So flax, there is that top line, followed by canola and soybeans in the purple and pink lines. Cereals are towards the bottom. So notice the 3-year historic trends for all of those crops. That starts from January of 17 and goes until last week, January 15th, I believe, of 2021. So notice how closely linked the canola and soy prices mirror each other, while flax is largely independent, but it has been pushed higher in those recent months to record highs. Depending on where you're located, the average price across Manitoba right now is $19.75 a bushel for old crop flax. There have been places where it's been picking over 20 bucks. Now, high oilseed prices compared to cereals is certainly going to push more acres into these oilseed crops in 2021. Flax growers will still have the opportunity to lock in a profit despite any acreage increase. And some of the new crop numbers I'm reading today are, where were they? Almost $15 right now. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, over the past 56 years, shown on this graph, flax production acreage has dropped dramatically, largely due to other oilseed crops that have filled a niche in the market, and in terms of ease of production. Since flax is not the easiest crop to grow, it takes more experienced and persistent growers to have long-term success with this crop. It's partly why yields have had noticeable increases in recent years, despite overall acreage being reduced. So that green line there is showing the overall yield increase, the average yield across Manitoba. This past year, we set a record at or very near 32 bushel an acre, according to crop insurance figures. So each flax acre is producing about 2/3 of a metric ton of grain. So this sharp increase in land productivity has really gone up over the past 10 years, and it corresponds to a reduction in acres as well, since non-traditional flax growers have sort of dropped out of the market and left some of those key growers in, and they are achieving higher success. So flax is one of those crops that takes a bit of experience to do well, and to have consistently good results. It's a crop that farmers will need to stick with for a little bit of time. To jump in one year when the markets are really good seems very attractive, but in order to do well with that, you're going to have to pay close attention to the agronomics rather than just getting in, getting out. Okay, moving on to crop fertility. Now, let's start with field selection. Just find my notes here. Perfect. So flax is best suited to your highly productive fields. I mean, flax is traditionally seen as a low input crop, and it can be planted virtually anywhere in Manitoba, but it will perform best on those highly productive fields, just like really any other crop. You want to give it the groceries, give it a nice loamy soil. For the most part, it can do very well in heavy clay, as long as that heavy clay is well drained, and that's the ideal spot for it. Lionel did bring a question to my attention yesterday afternoon about salinity and how tolerant flax is of salinity. So if you're looking in the middle line of the graph on your screen, that will show you, pardon me, I'm just going to highlight it. Here we go. That middle line shows you where flax is going to be slightly tolerant of salinity. So if you have salinity measured between 4 to 8 decisiemens per meter, that's considered moderately saline. Flax will tolerate those conditions, but it is only slightly less sensitive than canola. Corn, soybeans, and sunflowers are certainly more sensitive. Flax can be grown in land that canola, wheat, oats will be grown regularly and not see too much of an issue. When you're selecting a field, you want to know what your herbicide rotation has been, see if there's any residual products there. We'll address that a little more later, as well as finding a field that's relatively weed-free. Flax is not a very competitive crop, so in order to have that crop compete well, give it the best start you possibly can. And that last photo there on the left is really just remember your wet socks. Flax does not like having wet feet. If it sits in water for more than 12 hours, it's really going to suffer. Yields will suffer, plants will die if that occurs once or even too frequently, totaling over 12 hours. So those heavy clay soils work well as long as you can have it well drained or have good surface drainage. Those loamier soils in the rolling landscapes a little further west of Manitoba do tend to do very well for flax. All right. Now, looking at relative stubble yield response, if you're planning on growing the crop, know where it fits as a rotational crop. Based on crop insurance data from 2010 to 2015, flax grown after cereals and legumes does seem to have a significant yield boost than following canola or flax on flax when compared to the provincial average yield. So stick on those crop stubbles where you know you're going to have a benefit rather than having the yield drag from canola or flax on flax rotation. So a few reasons for that. Flax being a strongly mycorrhizal crop, it needs an established fungal network to access nutrients, particularly phosphorus. Canola is not supportive of a mycorrhizal network, and that network is effectively dead when you sow a canola stubble. And the reason for flax on flax drag is pasmo, particularly. Pasmo is a stubble-borne disease, and if you have infected stubble on a subsequent flax crop, that can really transfer over and be detrimental to yield. But if we're talking specifically about nutrients, I borrowed these slides from John Hurd, so you'll have to thank him for that. Some of this information is a little bit older because flax fertility research has not been a high priority in Western Canada for a number of years. But here we have flax response to nitrogen at 3 sites in Saskatchewan. So what you're going to notice there is as you increase the yield, or pardon me, increase the nitrogen content from 0, 40, 80 to 120 pounds per acre N, your yields are correspondingly increasing. You're starting to plateau about that 80 pound per acre nitrogen rate. The economic impact of adding 120 or that extra 40 pounds of N isn't very significant at this point. This does tend to plateau, but certainly flax can benefit from higher levels of nitrogen, not the traditionally lower levels or the lower inputs that we've been associating with the crop. Flipping over to next slide over. Each cluster of columns represents an additional nutrient. So the check with no applied fertilizer, and we have nitrogen, phosphorus, NPK, NPS, and NPKS. So if we're looking at that first circled column, the yield benefit increase is mostly with nitrogen and phosphorus, those first 2 columns. There is relatively little additional yield that is added on by additional sulfur or additional potash in flax. The N and the P are the primary components driving yield in flax, and even principally nitrogen. So that's been the big determining factor here in this yield in the late 90s. Now, what are Manitoba flax growers doing? Based on a 2014 survey of flax growers in our province, nearly half of growers were applying 31 to 60 pounds of nitrogen in the crop. Based on the yield potential and the potential for flax response to nitrogen, pushing those values a little higher can benefit, as we just saw in the previous 2 slides. But it does result in later maturity, about 70% of the time. And that can push it back from anywhere from 2 days to about a week. So higher nitrogen does make that crop stay green longer, and that does impact harvest management. However, to achieve those top yields, flax does need to be treated like a high yielding crop, not a low input, last minute afterthought. So combat those factors by planting enough seed. If you're going to be using higher nitrogen, enough seed to soak up the goodies and turn that into yield. Moving over to phosphorus, flax yield did not respond to either side-banded phosphorus or provide a phosphorus supplement in 9 site years in Manitoba. This is based off of Dr. Cindy Grant's work at Ag Canada Brandon. So she's got 3 Manitoba-based sites here where side-banded phosphorus really did not result in any additional yield per acre. And we just mentioned that phosphorus is an important component to flax yield. But what this is telling us is that phosphorus fertilizer, MAP, monoammonium phosphate, is not the prime driver of yield in flax. So phosphorus is, but phosphate fertilizer is not. We'll touch on that in just a slide. Now, in that same phosphorus conversation, let's look at what the mycorrhizae do for flax. I have a picture of corn here because I could not actually find any pictures of flax with the phosphorus deficiency on the web, and I didn't have any on my phone. So corn is what we're going to use as an example. Now, you're looking here on the margins, particularly this center plant. You're seeing a bit of a darkish coloration around the margins in the leaf. That is a key sign of poor phosphorus uptake. The purple discoloration, that's stunting. You have that same effect on flax, but it is going to be a little less noticeable. You're going to have darker leaves, and that margin effect isn't quite so clear because flax doesn't have those very clear veins running through the leaf, and they're also a lot smaller. Now, canola as a previous crop, as I mentioned, reduces levels of mycorrhizae in the soil. Now, because we were just talking about phosphorus and how phosphate fertilizer doesn't seem to impact yield, but phosphorus itself does, well, it's because flax doesn't use applied phosphorus terribly well. So it's greatly affected by the previous crop and the previous crop stubble and that hyphae network that's left there. So if that soil is left in a zero-till situation or a reduced tillage situation, there's going to be less disturbance and less breakage of those fungal hyphae networks that are growing throughout the soil. So if that's left in place, that fungal hyphae network is stronger after a cereal crop, for instance, and that will increase the amount of root hair surface area. You can extend up to about 4 inches outside of a root hair, and that will greatly increase phosphorus interception. And it's pulling phosphorus from the soil reserves and the soil organic matter component. It's not really pulling it from phosphate fertilizer at this point. So really what we were trying to get is a soil that's high in phosphate residual fertility, not necessarily higher in applied phosphorus. So how do we get that phosphorus into the plant earlier in the season? What do we do with the placement? Well, side banding is beneficial in terms of the seed safety perspective, but it doesn't seem to add too much yield, and it does. And putting down phosphorus is necessary just simply to replace for your future crop. Do we rely on the natural system? In flax, that is more than likely the case, pulling from the organic and the mineralizable portion in the soil rather than the fertilizer component. So you can front load up prior crops. Doing a soil test to know where you're at is certainly beneficial. I wouldn't recommend putting flax on a patch of ground without having a soil test, as well as managing the rotation. So you're not following flax after canola. Now, in terms of micronutrients, zinc and iron are the most commonly used micronutrients in flax, and those deficiency symptoms would be the most common micros to show up in Manitoba. Still not terribly common, but if you are seeing a micronutrient issue, those are likely the two. So that can be caused by field and soil variability, cool, wet springs, which prevent root growth and root uptake of those nutrients since they need to be intercepted. They don't move by mass flow. Another micronutrient deficiency that is often reported or thought to be an issue is calcium. Calcium causes that chlorotic top or a shepherd's crook that's forming in the top of flax. That can occur from a severe calcium deficiency, but calcium deficiency, given our calcareous soils, is not common in our province and is more likely a glyphosate drift issue. So if you've got flax that has a very weird, distorted, shrunken, discolored top, check the crops around it. See if there's a glyphosate tolerant crop that may have had an issue with the wind at the time of application that could have moved over onto the field. Flax is very sensitive to glyphosate drift in that sense. So there we go. Now, this is just to summarize the fertility side. So flax responds best to fertile soils, not fertilizer in the case of phosphorus and as well as potassium. We do not tend to see a yield response to P and K unless you have very low soils, in which case applied fertilizer is going to be beneficial. Flax is somewhat sensitive to seed-placed fertilizer. Certainly check the Manitoba Guide to Crop Fertility. So there's recommended no more than 20 pounds of P2O5 in the seed row, and no additional N in the furrow. Moving it over to the sideband is certainly a safer option. The reason we can tolerate up to 20 pounds, potentially even more in the seed row, is generally because we've moved to a wider seed boot spacing. There's not too many press drills around anymore. So most flax crops are generally seeded with a sweep opener, a couple inches spread, and that allows to put a little bit more fertilizer down in the seed. Otherwise, flax would be about as tolerant as canola, meaning that it can't handle too much in the furrow. But up to 20 pounds is recommended as safe. But I'll certainly do know what your soils are capable of and what your seedbed utilization is. Now, this question came up a couple times too. Using Jumpstart, or a biological penicillin bly, I believe is the active ingredient there. In flax, does that have a benefit? Because we know that it's a known phosphate solubilizer. It can be used on corn, canola seed treatments fairly frequently and fairly common already across Western Canada. Would it have the same effect on flax? Would it make phosphate more available? Well, based on trials conducted mostly in Saskatchewan between 2015 and 2017, Nexus BioAg conducted strip trials in flax with seed-applied Jumpstart compared to an untreated check of a number of different varieties. These trials used, I think, 4 or 5 different varieties. They weren't all listed, as well as different seeding equipment. So it's all on-farm stuff. It's not using small plot research equipment. Unfortunately, no fertility data was given in the reporting, prior background fertility levels. So this information cannot fully be relied upon as accurate, since I simply pulled it from the company's website. The blue bars on the bottom of the line graph indicate the positive or negative difference that Jumpstart had compared to the non-replicated strip at that one site in that 1 year. This is not aggregated data, this is single site year data. Now, excluding that one outlier at Hamiota on the far left, yields ranged from negative 4.6 to positive 3.9 bushels an acre, depending on the site. And if that one outlier was included, the average yield bump was only 1.8 bushels an acre over all 3 years. It's not a huge jump, and in some cases it actually resulted in a yield loss by applying Jumpstart with the seed. So I will leave that to the farmer to discuss with their retailer if that's something that's worth it, and knowing what the cost would be in order to consider applying. Just a bit of a summary slide here on flax fertility. So fertilize flax in much the same way as you would for a good oat crop, plus a little more sulfur, or knowing that you have a good reserve of sulfur in the soil. Now, the 45 bushel per acre column with the double asterisk is what would be recommended if you were to use the numbers that are already existing in the Manitoba Soil Fertility Guide and just extrapolate it out to a high 45 bushel an acre yield. The green columns, if you look at the two greens, that is what already exists in the Manitoba Soil Fertility Guide. So our uptake and removal, both are listed there, but flax is going to be taking up about 3 pounds, just under 3 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. And then bring that over to 30 bushels an acre, it will require about 70 pounds, man. If we were to use that same math and that same number, it would require 129 pounds of N to get 45 bushels an acre. Practical experience has told me that that is too high, and we're going to result in too many weed issues, too many lodging issues in flax. A more realistic value to target that 45, 50-ish bushel an acre range on soils that are certainly suited for a flax crop would be more like 110 pounds an acre. And that number has been extended now for the other crops, or for the other products, I mean. So 110, 35, about 65, and then 20 to 25 pounds of sulfur. Now, that much sulfur down the seed row is certainly going to be toxic to the seed. Looking at side banding, looking at having a higher residual sulfur value, those sorts of things are going to be necessary. Now, we mentioned that flax does not respond particularly well to phosphate and potash fertilizers. So looking at a field that has high residual fertility is going to be key for those two nutrients. You can put that blend down, but if you're going to be doing it, putting that much down, put it away from the seed or incorporate it in some other way, front load another crop prior in order to replace the values that a high yielding flax crop is going to take out. So there are going to be times certainly when 70 pounds of nitrogen an acre is certainly not going to be enough. Others where it might even be too much, and lodging could occur. But really watch the ratings in Seed Manitoba when you're picking a variety to see what the lodging resistance score is. So that brings us to the end of the flax chapter. Moving on to rotation and disease management. We're going to jump around a little bit. It's not going to make a lot of chronological sense, but these two topics do go together very, very well. So I think it's important to address this before we get into seed selection. Now, flax is a rotational crop. The big benefit here is that flax is not susceptible to any, with a small asterisk, of other major diseases affecting other crops. So the other asterisk means sclerotinia can be an issue in flax, but only under very, very high disease pressure years. Crops like sunflowers, canola, dry edible beans, soybeans are certainly going to be more severely affected in those high sclerotinia years than flax would be. Flax is one of the lower susceptible ones just due to the nature of the crop, the space between the canopy, the size of the stem, those sorts of things. So I don't put too much of an emphasis on sclerotinia unless we're going to have a very, very wet, soggy year, and the long-term forecast doesn't look like that at this time. So it does provide a nice clean disease break for other crops. It's not a host to cereal diseases. It's not a host to other oilseed crop diseases. And the diseases that do affect flax, pasmo in particular, can largely be managed via rotation and fungicide use. Now, changing gears quite dramatically here, I'm going to talk about clubroot and canola for a second. And a big part of the impetus for growing flax and why you might want to consider that is an alternative oilseed to canola. We typically grow between 3.2 and 3.5 million acres of canola in Manitoba each year. Flax acres hover between 20 and about 80,000 acres for the past 10 years in Manitoba. Big, big difference. So with such a large amount of canola grown each year, clubroot is starting to become more and more of a problem. And I like to recommend flax as an alternative oilseed that is not susceptible to this clubroot issue, and it won't build up clubroot spores in the soil. So this map shows where infected fields are spread out in Manitoba, where symptomatic fields have occurred. There's now 10 municipalities. We added 2 more this year, the RMs of Alexander up in northeastern Manitoba and the RM of Roblin in western Manitoba. So this is just where we're finding clubroot and the spore levels. Now, if I flip over one map, the GIF or GIF, however you want to say that, on the left side shows the intensity and the concentration of canola acreage from 2016 to 2019 as a percentage of the arable acres in the municipality. So you'll notice the deeper the red color, the more frequently canola is grown in rotation, or if it is in fact a rotation at all. The percent of acres each year, if that red color is over 49% of acres in a municipality each year, it means that canola is grown on that ground more often than 1 in 2 years. So basically every other year, or every year, pardon me. That is a recipe for severe blackleg clubroot and other disease disasters, and the possibility that resistance will stop working sooner. So that clubroot map doesn't really show what's happening in northwestern Manitoba, particularly around Riding Mountain Park with the concentration of canola. That's certainly an area that clubroot could become more severe, and then that might be more suited to having flax as an alternate oilseed. So on the right is that same map, but for flax in rotation. There's a big difference there in terms of percentage. The highest here is only 2.7% in Oakland Wawinisa. So that's significantly lower, where the lowest canola percentage in eastern Manitoba is about 11%. So we're still a solid 8% below that in terms of flax acres. So there's lots of room for flax to grow. This was the point of this one. Now, if we're talking about flax diseases, there's certainly a couple that you need to look out for. Rust being one of those. The last major epidemic was in the 1970s, and currently every flax variety grown and registered in Canada has genetic resistance to rust. Fusarium wilt, another one, is a strain specific to flax. It does occur from time to time, and it does have those wilt-like symptoms and that plant death later on in life. Using resistant varieties, they're generally all moderately resistant to Fusarium wilt. Treated seed, if that is a concern, or just lengthening the rotation to 1 in 3 years, really helps reduce the risk there. The last would be powdery mildew. On this slide anyway. So there's a little more prevalent in lower humidity summers with cool nights. We haven't been having those summers with those cool nights for quite a while, so I haven't seen much powdery mildew at all. And typically, if it does occur, it occurs in areas that are double seeded, excess seed on headlands, those sorts of things, or in a very small microclimate. Usually not particularly widespread, but it can become a little more severe, especially when you have years with high levels of potato aphid, which are a flax insect as well. So the other two, the big hitters with flax, pardon me, are Pasmo, which are the 2 photos on your screen. Septoria linicola, which is currently our most damaging disease and the most critical disease to manage in flax. The best way to reduce it is simply by having a good 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 year rotation. Since infection is spread from infected crop residue, baling, incorporation, or burning are effective ways to reduce disease pressure for future years. Obviously, I'm not going to advocate for burning, although that is very common in flax. If you're able to bale the straw off or to cut down in size and incorporate it into the soil, that's much better, and it will break down over the next couple of years. So as stubble breaks down, so does the risk of disease on future crops. So the symptoms here of Pasmo are a brown girdling of the stem. Really what that ends up doing is choking off any seed production that happens above it. You can see this side branch is basically done. Any seed that's on the top of that umbro will not be sizable, or there will not be any seed there to begin with. Earlier symptoms have a brown flecking on the leaves, and that flecking on the leaves then moves onto the stem later in the season. The yield losses can be between 5 to 30% if left unmanaged, but there are some good fungicide options for this. Sclerotinia, as I just mentioned, those same humid, damp conditions, but flax is less susceptible, as based on that ranking that we have on the screen there. Any questions for right now, Lori?
Actually, there is one question.
Okay.
Okay. What would you recommend for safe seed placement in a disc drill, a John Deere disc drill?
John Deere disc drill. Safe seed placement. In what sense, I guess, would be the next
It
question.
says MAP or MAP. Is that helpful?
Oh yes, monoammonium phosphate. Yes. How much phosphate could you put down with a seed in a disc drill? I might recommend between 10 and 15 pounds an acre, without knowing what your soil type is or knowing your seed bed utilization or your row spacing. If your row spacing is tighter, say it's only 7.5 inches, pushing that number a little higher might be safe. You could go up to about 20 pounds in that instance, which we had on the screen earlier. Depends also on your soil moisture and your soil texture. So if that grower has any specific questions, my name and number will be at the end of the slide too. Have them send me a note and we can discuss
there
it
was
in more detail.
there was a second comment about heavy clay, 10 inches, very low SBU.
Yes, we're using a disc drill on a heavier clay. Heavier clay is going to work in your benefit in this case because there's more binding sites on a clay soil for fertilizer particles than there is on a sandy soil or a sandy loam. So you can get some benefit there, especially if the soil is a little moist. If the soil is dry, obviously then there's more of a risk of fertilizer toxicity. Keeping your nitrogen and largely your sulfur out of the seed row is going to be a standard practice with flax. You don't want to have that in the seed row. Phosphate is really the only product you can get away with in the furrow with flax. If you're working on 10-inch spacing, your seed bed utilization is certainly going to be lower than say on 7.5. So perhaps looking at that number, looking at what the spring values would bring and bumping that number down if there's specific concerns, perhaps about 15 pounds with the seed. You may want to make the balance up in a blend that's going across the field, either pre-seed banded or mid-row banded, side band, those sorts of things. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, but I think that kind of explains that question. If there's specifics that you want to talk about, and the field scenario will vary by farmer and vary by however many miles you drive, do have the farmer give me a call, and I'd be happy to discuss each scenario because since each one's a little different.
Okay, and there's one more here. Do you need to spray fungicides prior to onset of PASMO, or can you control after symptoms appear?
It's generally a preventative, and I will get to that in one slide.
Okay, so that's all I have right now.
Right on, thank you. Oh, there we go. Okay. To address that fungicide question, most fungicides in flax, or pardon me, I should say some are systemic, meaning they are the strobilurin group from the group 11 product of fungicides, while some are contact. Those are the azoles, that's the group 3 section. They have different windows of application. Contact fungicides will require covering most of the petals, while systemics, the strobilurins, aren't as particular. Those strobilurins are going to be more of your PASMO protecting fungicides. The azoles are more for sclerotinia. So things like Acapella, Headline, and Preaxer, those you're not as fussy in terms of getting that contact on the plant. You're just trying to get it into the plant so it can move systemically. So there's a very broad range in terms of development and the timing of flowering in order to get that fungicide down. Yes, fungicides do need to be applied proactively and preventatively prior to disease development occurring. It is not going to act as a curative product. It's not going to slow or reduce PASMO infection once it's already started. Now, if you start with a good seed and you don't have or haven't had flax in that particular crop for a number of years, there should be no serious concern with PASMO. However, there are other added plant health benefits that do make a difference in terms of using a fungicide and having a healthier crop that has a bit of more of a stay green effect and helps put more of its energy into seed rather than fighting off disease. So using it as a proactive preventative measure is certainly a good idea if you're running into conditions where disease could be a problem. So the application windows there are listed between 20 to 50% bloom, and rating bloom in flax is going to be a little different than in canola, given that each flax flower only blooms for a day. A canola flower will bloom between 5 and 7 days on average. A flax flower will open in the morning, bloom during that day, and have to be pollinated that day, and then petals will start to drop. So that's why a flax field never looks quite as intensely blue as a canola field looks yellow, because those flowers don't stick around for as long. So trying to target that bloom, 20 to 50% bloom stage, is going to be a little more difficult than in canola. So you're going to have to do some little more intensive scouting there. Certainly 7 to 10 days after the first bloom is roughly when 20% flower hits. So usually that's about the middle of July. Now, moving on from diseases and fungicides, we're going to start talking about seed variety selection and seeding practices and how to achieve good success there. So what we're looking for in flax is good germination percentage. Germination can be severely affected by having flax sit in storage for a number of years. And when flax is not a popular crop, a grower might harvest the crop, throw it in the bin, sell some, and let the rest sit there for a year or two, or perhaps 3. Older flax seed does tend to reduce in germination percentage fairly quickly. So if you're considering using bin run seed, in this case, certainly I strongly recommend having a germination test done in order to figure out what seeding rate you're going to have to be using. If you're using bin run seed, pure live seed is going to be an important calculation there for you. So that's your pure seed percentage, not taking into account dockage or taking that factor out of your seed weight. So taking out the straw and the dockage and the unhulled or unthreshed bolls, you're looking at pure seed only. Multiply that by your germination percentage, multiply that by 100. That's going to give you your pure live seed factor, and that's a little bit more accurate than just a straight germination factor if you're using unclean seed. Now, when you're looking at certified seed, it's going to be a little bit harder to come by this year. Flax prices are rising, as we talked about earlier on, and new crop flax prices are also going up correspondingly. So seed prices then have typically jumped. Normally flax prices tend to be $20 to $24 a bushel. Currently my local information tells me that I can't get flax for any less than 28 bucks a bushel. So that seed price is certainly rising, meaning that a farmer might look at getting some offload bin run seed or buying from a neighbor. But remember, if you're buying from a neighbor and it's common seed, it cannot be sold with a variety name. So if they're selling it to you with a variety name, a certified seed tag would have to come along with it. So when you're dealing with your seed growers, ask for a seed report or test your own seed. Aim to seed or to use seed with at least 80% germination. Ideally, you'd want 90% or better. 1,000 seed weight is typically between 5 to 8 grams in flax, a little higher than canola. And the method of determining your seeding rate typically results in a lower than ideal recommendation. If you're using math to figure out how many seeds per acre or seeds per square foot you should be using, since survivability has not been taken into account. Flax survivability is typical of oil seeds, similar to canola being fairly low, where your survivability is between 50 to 60%. That's why we want to use a high germ, high seeding rate in order to have a successful crop. Now, in order to check what a good variety might be in your local seed supply, do take a look at the Seed Manitoba 2021 guide. That would have come out with your Manitoba Cooperator subscription back in, I believe it was early December. If you don't have a copy, contact your local Manitoba Ag Rep. We have them in our offices. I know it's going to be difficult to stop by and pick them up, but generally you can arrange to have one picked up if you don't have one handy, or the digital edition is available online. Now, digging into the seed guide a little bit more, these are the flax tables, the individual yield comparisons here. So this screenshot is from our 2021 guide, where there are 3 site locations with successful yield trials. Use caution when you're looking at data like this, because, for example, both Arborg and Roblin had crop yields that were much higher than the provincial average. They had average yields there of 55 and 51 bushels an acre, certainly much higher than the provincial average of 32. Even Boissevain was a fair bit higher at 35. Now, also pay close attention to the LSD value, the least significant difference right here. For a variety to be truly significantly different, meaning that the yield difference is due to genetics and not random chance, the variety needs to differ from a Czech or from another variety by the LSD value. In the case of, I said Melita here, but Boissevain and Roblin, that's 5 and 7 bushels respectively. So for example, CDC Roland at 40 bushels an acre was not significantly different than Westland 72 because it was not a difference of greater than 5 bushels right there. However, if you looked at AAC Marvelous compared to VT50, well, that's 9 bushels an acre, and that is bigger than 5. Therefore, there is a significant yield advantage to growing Marvelous versus VT50. To have a little bit more accurate look at data, look more at the long-term information. It can be more beneficial when selecting a variety here to look at the previous table instead, or this table instead. The list is varieties that are currently available and grown in Manitoba, as well as how many the site years tested. So in order to build confidence in a variety, the greater number of site years here indicates how many years it's been tested in post-registration variety testing in McVet each year. So we know a lot about CDC Bethune, given that it's been tested over 129 site years. We know a little bit less about AAC Bright, which has only been tested for 6 site years. So the greater number of site years, the more confident we are in that data that it's going to be repeatable year after year. So currently, CDC Glass, right here, is the check across Western Canada and has been typically one of the highest performing yield varieties, replacing CDC Bethune. Newer varieties with solid performance include Nila, Flava, AAC Bravo, Prairie Sapphire down here, and Westland 72. Newer varieties that are a little more limited in supply and we don't have as much yield data on and have not been tested as long include Bright, CDC Dorado, Roland down here, and CDC Burreux, pardon me, right there. Roland seems to be the one that we're getting a lot of grower attention on right now, given that it's got the highest average yield per acre. However, it is in seed multiplication phase, and I don't think there's anything commercially available this year. It is gone to seed growers, so hopefully by 2022, there is a supply available for certified seed purchase and production. Now, when you are selecting a variety, one thing that is often not mentioned is that there are 2 different flax types, brown and yellow, or golden flax. A golden flax variety typically has a bit of a yield drag compared to a brown seeded flax variety, but the advantages there could be that there might be a small market premium to have a non or a lower tannin seed coat flax, meaning it can go into different health food markets. It has different appeal with customers just because it doesn't have that dark color, it has that nice bright golden color. So depending on your market and depending on the premium, there might be an advantage to growing a yellow seeded variety rather than a brown. Other than that, the management of the crop is exactly the same. We're looking at seeding rate and placement now. Treat flax like a high value crop because it is. I mean, certainly at $20 a bushel or new crop at close to 15, that makes a difference. That is a significantly high value crop. It's not something cheap and simple that you just throw in last minute. You want to treat it well in order to get the best results you possibly can. The uniformity is going to be key in flax. Those thin spots do rob yield through less dense canopy and allowing more impact from weeds. Don't go too far to chase moisture. So you're going to have flax performing better if you left it drier on the drier side to let it germinate uniformly when that rain does arrive. So between 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches depth, I usually tend to prefer about 3/4 down, 3/4 to an inch down. If you're into moisture at that depth, great. If it's not, don't push it further. Let it be in the dry until that rain comes. Now, you'll see a wide range of recommended seeding rates based on whatever literature you're reading. It could be from the Flax Council, could be from Manitoba Ag, Saskatchewan, Alberta, North Dakota. What I have started recommending in the past number of years is increasing that seeding rate in order to have a thicker stand, have to allow it to compete a little bit better. I like to say at least a bushel, which is 56 pounds an acre, and no less than 3/4 of a bushel, which would equate to 42 pounds an acre. Traditionally recommended flax rates have been between 35 to about 45 pounds an acre. I find that to be a little bit low, especially if we're starting to target higher production, higher value, and we're starting to see yield response from higher fertility levels than we have in the past. So in that case, upping that seeding rate in order to compete with weeds, in order to have a good stand or a uniform stand, pushing that seeding rate closer to 50 to 56 pounds, that bushel an acre mark is ideal. Now I do have a note here that narrow rows are preferred. If you're going wider than 10-inch spacing, you're not going to be pleased with what you're seeing in flax. So that's typically too much space between the crop. And flax, not being a super competitive crop and not being super branchy, will not cover that canopy until late in the season, leaving a lot of space for weeds to grow, particularly things like cleavers, wild buckwheat. That can be a problem. So we're looking at something less than 10 inches is ideal. I ideally like to see something about 7.5-inch spacing. Now, if you have that 10-inch spacing, not too much of a problem, especially if you have a wider sweep on that shovel. But just remember to keep your seeding rates up and don't cheap out on seed in this case, in order to make sure you have that dense canopy. Seeding date for flax. Historically, flax didn't have a lot of weed control options. It still doesn't have terribly many. So mechanical tillage was done for weeds first, and then the flax was seeded later, late May to late June. Now, crop insurance data has told us that higher yields are achieved by seeding into the first half of May, immediately following cereals. And you can do that because flax, even if it does germinate, is relatively frost tolerant. Cotyledons will tolerate frost for up to 6 hours at -3. And that 2-leaf stage, if hardened off, will be frost tolerant to -8 for about 2 to 3 hours. So there is some fairly significant frost tolerance in very small flax. Once it grows taller than about 2 inches, that frost tolerance is then lost. So it has to be small at that stage. So you can realize that you can put flax in fairly early. The article that discusses what we're talking about the next couple slides is on the hyperlink there. So if you want to read more, you can just Google more competitive flax Manitoba cooperator and it'll pull up a lot of the slides that I'm showing you. The earlier seeding can have several benefits. So there's reduced competition with weeds, reduced vegetative growth later in season. So the earlier you seed the crop, generally the shorter it is, and you have to deal with less residue afterward. That late crop can lead to more harvest issues. There can be green stems and more wrapping prone, especially if you seed a little on the late side and you have a taller crop. Something to consider for an earlier seeding date. Now what we've got here is some photos from Crop Diagnostic School in 2018. We had 3 seeding dates here. This was all at 3/4 bushel or 42 pound an acre. Seeding date of May 8th, May 23rd, and June 5th. And now these pictures were all taken, I believe, about June 15th, June 20th, something like that. So it just shows you the difference in how well that canopy competed and closed. On June 5th, we had a uniform stubble across the entire plot, but you certainly see how the soil had dried out by June 5th. We didn't have a lot of moisture at that time. The seed wasn't placed properly. It started to germ and then died. So we had a very thin plot, a lot of staginess going on in that crop further at the back. So seeding earlier certainly has a better catch in this scenario. I guess I have some numbers here to share as well. The seed rate here was at 6,500 kernel weight at 42 pounds an acre with 92% germination and about 25% seeding mortality, meaning 75% survival. 42 pound an acre equals about 45 plants per square foot or about 400 plants per square meter. That is within the ideal recommended rate according to Flax Council of Canada and Manitoba Agriculture. So certainly that 400 plants per square meter, 42 pounds an acre is a good starting point. And from there, I would only go up if situations were more dicey. Now, with seeding rates, that leads us to a conversation on weed and crop management and how we're going to achieve the best possible crop we can. So starting off with weed control, a couple different options, cultural, mechanical, chemical, and biological. So cultural meaning what practices we can influence as farmers and agronomists to have a better crop. So things like seeding earlier where possible, seeding heavier, using clean seed, not dirty seed or old bin run seed. Make sure you're using a seed test or something to verify your germination. Mechanical weed control is simply iron, that's tillage, doing it in fall or spring, but it can reduce mycorrhizae from previous crops, breaking up that fungal network that is important. So if you can avoid using tillage, it might be a great option for you to do that. Red River Valley obviously is certainly a little bit more tillage prone. It might not be as common, but you can still have a pretty decent crop, flax crop otherwise. So things to consider. There's not as many herbicide options as other crops, but do check the Guide to Field Crop Protection. There's a lot of information in there. It tells you what you can do and when you can spray. And to address that a little bit more in detail here, pre-seed treatments are becoming more crucial to success in flax. So relying on a single in-crop option, which is what's shown on your screen, are generally insufficient to manage a wide spectrum of weeds, such as flax, as well as flax being sensitive to in-crop herbicides, particularly broadleaf products. So note that other herbicides are also not helpful for residual ahead of flax. Flurazolam, tribenuron, many of the group 2 products, and 2,4-D are all at least 1 year between application and a flax crop. And clearfield herbicide products, if you're growing a clearfield canola or clearfield wheat, lentils I suppose too, are generally 2 years before flax. Check the book for full details. I did have the question specifically on cleavers that came to me yesterday, and what we could do to control cleavers. There is very little in crop. You're going to see you're going to get a little bit of suppression with authority and authority charge as a pre-seed treatment, and you will get some control with bentazon, that is bazogram, but the spray window can be very, very small there. So flax must be greater than 2 inches tall in order to spray, and the cleavers must be small, between 1 to 3 whorl stage. So that really, really limits your application and your spray date with bazogram. And you also need a nice warm day in order for that to take effect. But the warmer it is when you're spraying flax, the sooner you're going to see that crop keel over and have that shepherd's crook effect until it grows out of that stressor. So it might not be the best option. Cleavers are going to be a weed that you're going to have to control generally ahead of time. What did I have here? Tillage is going to be a better option for cleavers in fall. Authority does have some suppression. There are some pre-seed products as well that might be a better fit. All right, just a few lessons on weed control from Crop Diagnostic School, again in 2018. This is what we had in terms of trials in the ground here. Pardon me, it's not allowing me to click. There we go. Okay, the first column was a lower 3/4 bushel seeding rate, so that's on your left-hand side. The second was a bushel an acre, while the third was the highest 1 1/4 bushel an acre rate. With the higher seeding rates, the trial dropped more advanced levels of pre-emergent weed management, and the rows indicated seeding dates spaced 2 weeks apart, so May 8th, May 23rd, and June 5th. So you'll notice here we had the lower seeding rate, but in order to compensate for the lower seeding rate and saving some seed costs, we went with a stronger pre-seed treatment. We didn't use any granular applied products, but we did use authority and glyphosate pre-emergent. We upped our seeding rate to bushel an acre, and we dropped the residual product and went with glyphosate alone. And then at the highest seeding rate, we had no pre-emergent product whatsoever, relying solely on in-crop products to take care of any weed issues. Now, I'll show you some of those photos here in a second. Okay, so these are those same photos. This is all from the same seeding date on this particular trial. I believe these were taken earlier on in the year based on the May 8th seeding date. So here we had 42 pounds an acre, but we used a stronger pre-emergent product. And you can still see the epinasty and the effects here on this weed. I believe it was a sow thistle of some kind, dying right here. But there was only really the one weed in this patch that we're looking to control. Everything else was smaller and was killed, and that residual product is working well. Now we remove that residual product, but we go with the higher seeding rates. You see the density is increased here slightly with flax, but we do have a few more weeds that glyphosate alone did not take out, or they emerged after. Volunteer canola here being the prime concern. And on the right-hand side, picture is a little more zoomed in, so it looks more dense than perhaps it might be, but it is certainly thicker. But we had no pre-seed product whatsoever. So here I've got a dandelion, a couple of dandelions, some more volunteer canola. I've got more weeds in this scenario that weren't controlled by any pre-seed herbicide. And that's going to be relied on strictly by cultural management with a heavier seeding rate or in-crop herbicides. Now the risk is that my in-crop herbicides might not be as effective, might cause more stress to the crop, or I might have resistant weeds to those groups that are being used. So what I would try and do is maybe not do this scenario. I would save some of my seed costs by not seeding quite so heavy, but I would seed heavy enough and use at least some pre-emergent herbicide in order to take care of some of those issues. But if I know I'm not going to have the funds or the seed available to go with a heavier seeding rate, I might cut my seeding rate down to that 3/4 and spend a little more money on pre-seed weed management. However, the opposite can occur too. If you don't have the time to get out with a sprayer early on in spring, this might be your better option. All right, just another follow-up photo here, how they look later on in the year. So you can see on the lower seeding rate, in fact, I actually have more lodging here. There's certainly more seed developments, more advanced, less flowering than the higher seeding rate, but I have a little more lodging. There's a bit of a lodge patch that's being pushed down here. Not quite so large, it's knitting together a little bit more at the higher seeding rate. And the highest rate, in fact, at this point, it wasn't lodged. I didn't go crazy with the nitrogen here. I think I did about 75 to 80 pounds, something like that. But my lodging isn't as severe, but I have enough seed there to soak up whatever nitrogen I've got. So my crop, in fact, isn't lodging here, and I have the highest yield potential given that I've got the number of seeds producing yield at the end of the year. So it's somewhat difficult to see the density, but you notice it with the lodging at this point. So there's a few more holes in the canopy here from those weeds that might have come through earlier. All right, lastly, let's look at the economics. I mean, flax to grow flax only makes sense if the economics pencil out, and they certainly do.
Dane, before you leave the weed control, I got a question for you here.
You bet.
As an aid in keeping the crop healthy, is there any value in using a fungicide with a herbicide for early prevention of fungal diseases?
Generally not. Generally, your herbicide pass comes much too early because your fungicide is going to be occurring at the bloom stages, and that crop has grown about a foot and a half between weed spraying and fungal spraying. Earlier disease infection with flax is not particularly common. You might have some seedling diseases, which a seed treatment could use. Generally, seed treatments are difficult to apply though, and it causes the seed to clump. So most farmers tend to skip that. And correspondingly, if they're going to be skipping a seed treatment, they might end up seeding a little heavier just to compensate that way. But to mix a fungicide in with your herbicide is not going to be a good idea because your surfactant load is going to be too high. Flax is extremely sensitive to in-crop herbicides. Anybody who's grown flax before knows that spraying curtail or Bactrim M over the top on a hot day is going to keel that flax over pretty good, and it's going to take some time for it to recover. Adding a fungicide on top of that is going to make that effect even worse with the excess surfactant in there. So I wouldn't recommend it. Do that in a separate pass. The other option too is even splitting your herbicide passes. I don't believe I actually wrote that anywhere on the previous slides, but that certainly can be done if you're spraying on a hot day and you know that it's going to be an issue. Going in with your grassy product first, and then going in with your broadleaf product first. I got that backwards. Go with your broadleaf product first, because by the time that crop keels over and decides to come back, those weeds should largely have been controlled with that broadleaf product, and then you can split it out by doing your grassy product 7 to 10 days later. Now you have a wider staging window with your grass product, which is why it's recommended after your broadleaf. Your broadleaf has a more limiting window. Do that first, come back and do your grass product later. But all grass products that are registered in flax are all group 1s. So if you have any group 1 resistant wild oats, green foxtail, yellow foxtail, those sorts of things, this is certainly where we need to look at using a pre-seed applied granular product. Something like a trifurulin in the fall prior might be a good option. Did I answer your question there, Lionel?
You bet, thanks.
Okay, right on. Lots of stuff to consider with flax. I could go on for a couple more hours if I had the time. Now, looking at the economics, I ran a sample calculator from Manitoba Ag's farm management section here, looking at profit and return per acre for a number of different crops. So what I've got here is canola, flax, hard red spring wheat, oats, soybeans, and corn, all based on a quarter section, and I inputted yesterday's prices that I was able to get at a local elevator here in the Red River Valley. This is where things could pencil out, and I put in some sample yields. Going a little more on the conservative side, I said 45, 35, 70, 130, 40, and 140 bushels an acre. So that math translates through based on those grain prices today. If I were to sell 100% of the crop, that's what my gross price per acre would be. Certainly, Flax migros is a little less than in canola, for example, and certainly less than it is in corn. But you'll notice that shakes out a little bit more at the end when you're looking at the net number per acre. Flax actually ends up being my second most profitable crop after corn, just due to the higher net return because of the lower variable input costs. So particularly here, know that your seed costs in flax are going to be high per bushel, but relatively lower compared to other crops, corn and soys and canola in particular. Herbicide options are going to be a little more expensive. I may have even under budgeted a little bit there on herbicides. Fungicide option, usually a single shot of Stubble product is going to be sufficient. Headline is rough pricing I used for this one. My fertilizer cost is certainly going to be less. Fertilizer prices have been rising, so if a farmer had locked in their fertilizer price, say prior to year end, chances are they're in good shape moving into 2021, or if they had any fall fertility applied, that certainly was at a low price this past fall. So take advantage of the low cost where you can. Crop insurance being a little higher than oats, for example, but not outlandishly high. Fuel and lube prices, I think I might have just pulled this over from my own farm. I think my average per acre is about $17.85. The calculator gave you a standard $15 or $13 an acre mark. Use whatever is relevant for your farm. I didn't have drying costs or any miscellaneous costs punched in at this point. And your fixed costs, certainly that will vary depending on farm scenario. But my point is looking at the variable cost and looking at your net per acre. Flax is certainly one of the more profitable crops. Corn can't be widely grown across Western Canada due to the heat unit restriction and the moisture restriction. Flax does have a much better fit in a broader spectrum of Manitoba than some of those other specialty crops. And in particular, even compared to 12 1/4 bushel price per bushel canola, flax is shaking out with, despite a lower yield, at a higher net return per acre. So the economics certainly do make sense to grow flax as an alternative oilseed from a price perspective, as well as from a disease and weed management perspective as well. There's some different groups you're bringing into flax. You're not exclusively using group 9s and 10s. The risk of that resistance building up is low, but you do have to watch that group 1 grassy product in your flax crop. Perhaps look at looking at using a pre-seed or pre-emergent product there as well. All right, with that, there's lots of information that can be found on flax, certainly all over the web. The Flax Council has a great resource published a number of years ago called Growing Flax. That is a bit of a heavy read, so if you got some late nights sitting at home during quarantine lockdown, go through that. There's a lot of useful information there on growing flax. I believe that's also available in many Manitoba Ag offices or available online. The Manitoba Crop Alliance has quite a number of resources on flax as well, since they've taken over, or with the merger of Manitoba Flax into the umbrella organization. MCA has quite a number of resources there. Our government web pages do also have flax in Manitoba. You can also check Saskatchewan and North Dakota web pages for information, or you can give me a call. With lockdown and quarantine being the way it is, I don't get to see anybody anymore, and I'm not in person in front of you during this call. So please feel free to give me a call. I'm happy to help walk you through it and point you in the right direction. And if you have any specific questions, I can try and address them then. Now, in summary, I talked about a lot of things here today. This is really what I would be recommending to get from that bronze level, more or less standard practice with flax, to that gold level flax. What can I do to really bring my flax production to the next level? So on bronze level, my standard thing is I'm going to be using older spin run seed. I may or may not be doing a seed germ test. I'm going to be seeding about 40, 42 pounds an acre. Just throw it in the air drill and just go, not think about it. As well as putting 30 pounds of P2O5 with the seed. If I have a wider, if I have a tighter row spacing and a wider seed spread in the furrow, I have 3-inch openers, for example, 30 pounds P2O5 is not unreasonable, which is why I still have a gold star. That's a pretty good practice for the most part. I know it's higher than our recommended number from the province, but flax is a little bit forgiving that way, and you can probably get away with it. If you're looking at a wider row spacing with a disc opener, less than an inch disturbance, 30 pounds is probably going to be a little too high. I might be seeding after June 1st. I thought about the crop last. I'm going to put it in some back quarter that I kind of forgot about. I'm not going to be doing pre-emergent herbicide. I might have cultivated or tilled prior to putting the crop in. My in-crop herbicide, I'm going to be looking at Bactrilem and Clethodim applied together at the same time. Now, If I'm running out of time and I don't want to go 2 passes over the field, I certainly can do that. But if the day becomes really, really hot, or I'm spraying on a very, very sunny day, that's going to cause that crop to look a little sick and take some time to recover. So if I really want to change that, I'd have to look over to my gold level. I'm not considering a fungicide. I might direct harvest. Nothing really wrong about that. But you could have some wrapping issues or things like that if there's no pre-harvest aid, or if it's not swathed and stored without aeration. Flax typically doesn't have storage issues, but it can cake just due to the nature of seed stacking. There's very little airflow that can get through that seed. So if it goes in a little bit moist or a little bit warm, it can stick together, and you do have flax cake that can be stuck on the bin walls. It can be difficult to sell afterward or move out of the bin. But now, if I want to bring my bronze level over to my gold level, starting with certified seed or a good seed test, lots of good varieties out there. Glass being the most common and widely available right now, together with a few others. Seeding a little heavier, 45 to 60 pounds an acre. I'm recommended 50 to 56 is kind of my comfort level. I'm going to fall band my fertilizer, my nitrogen particularly, ahead of time. And any phosphate I'm using is either going to go down mid-row or side band, or about up to 20 pounds with the seed. I'm going to seed it earlier, right after I'm done wheat and oats for the most part, wheat, oats, and barley, peas, I guess, too. Pre-emergent, I'm going to be using Authority Charge, which is a group 14 broadleaf ahead of the crop. Or if I know I've got a grassy weed problem with some resistance issues, I'm going to be using trifurulin in the fall prior. So that's my group 3 graminicide. Preflan being one of those products that cannot be applied ahead of the seed. It has to be going down the fall prior with flax. Other crops are not quite so sensitive. In crop, depending on the weed spectrum, if I've got more of a thistle issue, I'm going to go more curtail. If it's the regular stuff, I'll go with bucktrill. I'm going to be doing a split app. Going to be going my broadleaf first because my weed staging and my crop staging is going to be more sensitive there. And then I'm going to come back 7 to 10 days later with my grassy product. Fungicide, at bloom, I'm going to give it that plant health benefit where I can keep it green a little longer. That can run into issues for direct harvest, but it does tend to deal with any diseases that do crop up and prevents pasmo from becoming a serious issue, and helps me maximize my yield and have a healthier crop. I'm going to spray or pre-harvest if necessary. I may not. Depends on the fall and how it's going to be drying down. If you're going to be going in with a pre-harvest aid, you want to have 75% dry bowl. That means 75% of the crop is going to shake and rattle when you're walking in it. You hear the seeds rattling around in the bowls. Earlier than that, it's going to be a little too early. And I want to store it in a bin capable of aeration, just pushing some air through it, cooling it down, so I have a good product in order to sell. So lots of things to consider, but that's what I would do to bring my regular flax production up to that gold level standard and have a slightly better result and better experience. So seeding a little heavier, and I mean, we can't control the weather, but we certainly hope for just enough rain, not too much, not too little, and picking a good patch of ground with some good residual fertility to have a decent flax crop and a good shot at 40, 45 bushels an acre. So with that, in summary, genetics have improved in this crop, although it has been more modest than other crops. To achieve top yields in flax, site selection and agronomics play a much bigger role. The regular scouting and crop management is key to achieving that higher yield and a more profitable crop. And with that, I see I've taken up my hour in a little bit. If there's any questions, I can address them now if you're still on the call, or feel free to give me a call or an email anytime.
Hey, Dane, thanks. I think we answered most of the questions while you were going through the presentations. I don't see any other ones. Besides, I guess did get one on my text here that would you apply a fungicide more than once during the growing season?
No, it's generally not. It's generally not an issue. I would not apply it more than once. It would not be economically beneficial to do so. I've never seen it where we have had a severe pasmo year and a severe sclerotinia year combine all at once. Pasmo is generally driven by residue and crop rotation. So if you're going to be putting flax on flax, that's where you'd see the most severe effect. Generally, I apply personally on my own farm, I would apply a fungicide preventatively for pasmo, just because I like the benefit that it's going to be bringing to having a healthier crop and reducing the risk of that disease developing in the first place. This apply twice is not economically beneficial.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot, Dane, for doing the presentation. It was really well done and able to follow you through the whole thing. So thanks again for being on today. And Lori, if you could pass the screen over to me. Just a few slides left to finish off today's webinar. I want to bring to your attention again the extension specialists in Manitoba, and feel free to call on any one of these people for information. If you didn't get Dane's contact information, again, we'll be able to give you that information and or help you with some of your questions. We mentioned that we're going to be doing a few more of these winter crop talks, and next week I've got John Gavlosky booked in to do an insect update for us, especially some of the new seed treatments, as well as some of the things to look for in the spring. And regarding credits, send your info to Lori Forbes as always, and we will take care of it from there. There might be a couple changes with that coming in the next while. There might be somebody else helping us out with the credits, but for now, just send them to Lori. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and we'll see you next week, February the 3rd. Thanks.